Part 3. "Don't quit," Danny said to the truck, joking with it as he sometimes did with his children or his animals. "It's going to be downhill all the way home." He was making an uproar, and uproar gathered around him as he came to the outskirts of the city. The trailer trucks, sleek automobiles, and other competent vehicles now pressing around him made him aware of the disproportion between his shuddering, smoking old pickup and the job he had put it to, and he began to grin. He came to his exit and roared down into the grid of streets and lights. He continued to drive aggressively, though he had no plan to speak of. It yet seemed to him that what he had to do required him to keep up a good deal of momentum. At the hospital, he drove to the emergency entrance, parked as close to the door as he could without being too much in the light, got out and walked to the door as a man who walks, who knows exactly what he is doing and is already a little late. His cap, which usually sat well to the back of his head, he had now pulled forward until the bill was nearly parallel with his nose. Only when he was out of the truck and felt the air around him again did he realize that it was making up to rain. The emergency rooms and corridors were filled with the bloodied and the bewildered, for it was now the tail end of another Friday night of the great American spare time Civil War. Danny walked through the carnage like a man who was used to it. Past a set of propped open double doors, an empty gurney was standing against the corridor wall, its sheets neatly folded upon it. Without breaking stride, he took hold of it and went rapidly on down the corridor, pushing the gurney ahead of him. When he came to an elevator, he thumbed the up button and waited. When the doors opened, he saw that a small young nurse was already in the elevator, standing beside the control panel. He pushed the gurney carefully past her, nodding to her and smiling. He said, "4, please." She pushed the button. The doors closed. She looked at him, sighed, and shook her head. "It's been a long night." "Well," he said, "it ain't as long as it has been." At the 4th floor, the doors slid open. He pushed the gurney off the elevator. "Good night," the nurse said. He said, "Good night." He had to go by the 4th floor nurse's station, but there was only one nurse there, and she was talking with vehemence into the telephone. She did not look up. The door of Burley's room was shut. Danny pushed the gurney in and reshut the door. Now he was frightened, and yet there was no caution in him. He did not give himself time to think or to hesitate. Burley was lying white and still in the pallid light. Danny took a pair of rubber gloves from the container affixed to the wall and put them on. Wetting a rag at the wash basin, he carefully washed the handle of the gurney. He then pushed the gurney up near the bed and removed the folded sheet from it. Leaning over the bed, he spoke in a low voice to Burley. "Listen, I'm going to take you home. Don't worry, it's me. It's Danny." Gently, he withdrew the tube from Burley's nose. Gently, he pulled away the adhesive tapes and took the needle out of Burley's arm. He took hold of the tube of the bladder catheter as if to pull it out also, and then, thinking again, took out his pocket knife and cut the tube in two. He gathered Burley into his arms and held him a moment, surprised by his lightness. And then gently he laid him onto the gurney. He unfolded the sheet and draped it over Burley, covering him entirely from head to foot. He opened the door, pushed the gurney through, and closed the door. The nurse at the nurse's station was still on the phone. "I told you no," she was saying. "N-O, period. You have just got to understand, when I say no, I mean no." Near the elevator, 2 janitors were leaning against the wall, mops in hand, as stupefied, apparently, as the soldiers at the tomb. When the elevator arrived, the same nurse was on it. She gave him a smile of recognition. "My goodness, I believe we must be on the same schedule tonight." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She hardly glanced at the still figure on the gurney. She's used to it, he thought, but he was careful nonetheless to stand in such a way as to make it hard for her to see, if she looked, that this corpse was breathing. "One?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "if you please." Once out of the elevator, he rolled the gurney rapidly down the corridor and through the place of emergency. A man with a bandaged eye stood at his side as Danny approached and went without stopping out through the automatic doors. A slow rain had begun to fall, and now the pavement was shining. The Coulter lane turned off the blacktop a mile or so beyond Port William. Danny drove past the lane, following the blacktop on down again into the river valley. Presently, he turned left onto a gravel road, and after a mile or so, turned left again into the lower end of the Coulter Lane, passable now for not much more than 100 yards. Where a deep gully had been washed across the road, he stopped the truck. He was in a kind of burrow, deep under the trees in a narrow crease of the hill, the Stepstone Hollow. He switched off the engine and sat still, letting the quiet and the good darkness settle around him. He had been gone perhaps 2 hours and a half, and not for a minute during that time had he ceased to hurry. So resolutely he had kept up the momentum of his haste that his going and his coming back had been as much one movement as a leap. And now, that movement completed, he began to take his time. In the quiet he could hear Burley's breathing, slow and shallow, but still regular. He heard, too, the slow rain falling on the woods and the trees dripping steadily onto the roof of the truck. "Well," he said quietly to Burley, "here's somewhere you've been before." The shallow breathing merely continued out of the dark where Burley, wrapped in his sheet, slumped against the door. "Listen," Danny said. "We're in the Stepstone Hollow. It's raining just a little drizzling rain, and the trees are dripping. That's what you hear. You can pretty near just listen and tell where you are. In a minute I'm going to take you up to the old barn. You don't have a thing to worry about any more." He got out and stood a moment, accepting the dark and the rain. There was, in spite of the overcast, some brightness in the sky. He could see a little. He took his flashlight from the pocket of his coat and blinked at once. The bundle of bedclothes and food that he had brought from the house lay with the coat on the seat beside Burley. Then he dragged the bundle out and suspended it from his right shoulder, shortening the string to make the load as manageable as possible. Taking the flashlight, he then went around the truck and gently opened the door on the other side. He tucked the sheets snugly around Burley and then covered his head and chest with the coat. "Now," he said, "I'm going to pick you up and carry you a ways." Keeping the flashlight in his right hand, he gathered Burley up into his arms, kneed the door shut, and started up the hollow through the rain. He used the light to cross the gully. Beyond there, he needed only to blink the light occasionally to show himself the lay of things. Though his burden was awkward and the wet and drooping foliage brushed him on both sides, he could walk without trouble. He made almost no sound and was grateful for the silence and slowness and effort after his loud passage out from the city. It occurred to him then that this was a season-changing rain. Tomorrow would be clear and cool, the first fall day. It was a quarter of a mile or more up to the barn, and his arms were aching well before he got there. But having once taken this burden up, he dared not set it down. The barn, doorless and sagging, stood on a tiny shelf of bottomland beside the branch. It was built in the young manhood of Dave Coulter, Burley's father, to house the tobacco crops from the fields, now long abandoned and overgrown, on the north slopes above it. Abandoned along with its fields, the barn had been used for many years only by groundhogs and other wild creatures, and by Burley and Danny, who would shelter there on rainy days and nights. Danny knew this place in the dark as well as he could see it. On the old northward-facing slopes, on one side of the branch, was a thicket of 40-year-old trees, redbud, elm, box elder, walnut, locust, ash, the trees of the pioneer generation, returning the fields to the forest. On the south slope, where the soil was rockier and shallower, stood the uninterrupted forest of white and red oaks, and chinkapins, hickories, ashes, and maples, many of them 200 or 300 years old. Needing the light now that they were in the cavern of the barn, Danny carried Burley the length of the driveway, stepping around a derelict wagon, and then into a stripping room attached at one corner. This was a small shed that was tighter and better preserved than the barn. A bench ran the length of the north side under a row of windows. Danny propped Burley against the wall at the near end of the bench, which he then swept clean with an old burlap sack. He made a pallet of the bedclothes and laid Burley on it, and covered him. "Now," he said, "I've got to go back to the truck for some things. You're in the old barn on Stepstone, and you're all right. I won't be gone but for a few minutes." He shone the light a moment on the still face, In its profound sleep, it wore a solemnity that Burley, in his waking life, would never have allowed. And yet it was, as it had not been in the hospital, unmistakably the face of the man who for 82 years had been Burley Coulter. Here, where it belonged, the face thus identified itself and assumed a power that kept Danny standing there, shining the light on it, and that made him say to himself with care, "Now these are the last things. Now what happens will not happen again in his life." He hurried back along the road to the truck and removed an axe, a spade, and a heavy steel spud bar from among the fencing tools in the back. The rain continued, falling steadily as it had fallen since it began. He shouldered the bar and spade, and carrying the axe in his left hand, returned to the barn. Burley had not moved. He breathed on as steadily and forcelessly as the falling rain. "You're in a good place," Danny said. "You've slept here before, and you're all right. Now I've got to sleep a little myself. I'll be close by." He was tired at last. There were several sheets of old roofing stacked in the barn, and he took two of these, laying one on the floor just inside the open door nearest to the shed where Burley slept, and propping the other as a shield from the draft that was pulling up the driveway. He lay down on his back and folded his arms on his chest. His clothes were damp, but with his hunting coat snug around him, he was warm enough. Though in his coming and going he had hardly made a sound, once he lay still, the woods around the barn resembled a quiet that was a larger and older than his own. It was as though the woods had stopped whatever it was doing to regard him as he entered, had permitted itself to be distracted by him and his burden and his task, and now that he had ceased to move, it went back to its unfinished preoccupations. The rain went on with its steady patter on the barn roof and on the leafy woods. Danny lay still and thought of all that had happened since nightfall, and of what he might yet have ahead of him. For a while he continued to feel in all his nerves the swaying of the old truck as it sped along the curves of the highway. And then he ceased to think either of the past or of what was to come. The rain continued to fall. The flowing branch made a varying little song in his mind. His mind went slowly to and fro, with a dark treetop in the wind. And then he slept.